And I'm Jordan Hyde.
And we have Mind in the Making, Chapter 4, which is Making Connections. So, kind of a summary of making connections. It's that in life, making connections can help students understand the different concepts in whole in order to expand their thinking. Connecting a student's prior knowledge involves figuring out what's the same or similar, figuring out what is different, figuring out how one thing relates to another, and finding unusual connections. Children are making connections all the time. They're making connections as they are learning that sounds stand for words, words stands for people, places, or things in their world, and that symbols stand for the words they hear and say. So, Galinsky talks about three different precursors to human knowledge and skills as early as infants, first few months of life. And so the first one of these is object sense, and researchers did an experiment where they brought babies into an infant lab, and they sat the infants on their parents' laps and had them face a curtain puppet stage. And when these curtains raised, the babies saw a tall, upright rod moving back and forth across the stage. The rod's middle section was hidden by a long block stretching across the middle of the stage, so all the baby actually sees is only only sees the top and the bottom half of the rod in motion. And what the researchers were trying to find out was if you show a baby a rod that the top and bottom are visible, but the center is hidden behind another object that's placed in front of it, can babies perceive the complete shape of the rod? And so they use it's called the familiarization procedure, meaning when babies see something again and again, they become tired of it and pay less attention each time. What they observed was that the first time the baby sees the rod, they look at it for a fairly long time. Then, if you continue to show them the same action, they look less and less until eventually their looking time has gotten low. Essentially, the infants are bored. So when the babies got bored of the first scene, which was the rod moving back and forth with the middle hidden by a block, they showed them two different scenarios. The first one was that they moved the rod back and forth across the stage without the block hiding the middle. And then the second scenario was the two pieces of the rod, the bottom half and the top half, moving together across the stage with a gap in between them. And what the researchers found was that if babies had a complete rod in the initial presentation, even if the middle part of the rod was hidden, that they got bored with it. They should continue to be bored when you show them the complete rod and be more interested when you show them the rod with the gap. When they continued boredom with the complete object, the greater interest with the two object pieces. They found this was with 4-month-old infants. So what this is showing us basically through research is that babies' brains appear to be wired to go beyond the immediately available visual information and to perceive objects. So having an object sense is essential in understanding how objects, energy, space, and time interact. The next sense is called the space sense, and this is making connections between symbols and what they represent is an essential connection for humans to make. Children's early sense of space provides a foundation for further learning, like using this to develop increasingly complex understandings of place, space, and geometry. As a human race, we have a significant symbolic capacity. A huge part of what we know comes through symbolic representation. Children need to understand that symbols stand for objects. Making these connections of relationships between symbols and objects typically emerge as early as 3 years old to 5 years old, but everyone is born with some sense of space. So, a group of researchers worked with a 2.5-year-old child who had been blind from birth to see how she navigated space. They set up a room that contained objects in 4 locations. So Kelly's mom, the little girl's mom, was seated in the front of the room in a chair. On the right side of the room was a basket of toys. On the left side of the room was a stack of pillows, and in the back was a table. One researcher led the child back and forth twice between each of the 3 destinations from her mother. At each destination, the toys, table, and pillows she touched what she found at each. Then the researchers left Kelly by the table and had her go to the toy basket or the pillows. Kelly had never walked these routes before, but 8 out of 10 times she was asked to do this, she took a new and more direct route. The researchers then moved each object 90 degrees while maintaining their angular relationship to one another. Kelly was able to repeat this again 5 out of 8 times. So to determine whether blind children may be more attuned to children finding their way using geographic clues than children with sight, the researchers did the same exact experiment with sighted three-year-olds with blindfolds. They found that both children, blinded or sighted, have a sense of space. Other studies were done with children without blindfolds in rooms that have clues such as colors of walls, and it shows us that young children use geometry of their environment they are in to help them find their way. Once children are 3 or older, they start to learn to make connection using clues that go beyond the geometry of space. An experiment was done on an Amazonian tribe who had no formal schooling and have a lack of mathematic, geometric, or spatial words in their vocabulary. In this experiment, they found that children and adults turn to basic geometric principles to locate hidden objects. This is proof that we are all wired to have an intuitive understanding of space. And then the last one is number sense. So people traditionally in the United States label themselves as having a math brain or not being good at math. But what research has discovered in everyone that everyone is born with number sense. But through experiences and making connections is when we can strengthen that sense or not. So the saying of, I'm not a math person, is not inherently true. That may depend on the experiences or teaching that you have had. There obviously are people who may be better at math, but there are people who are just born without it. So researchers did an experiment where they wanted to find out whether infants could tell the difference between large and small numbers. So they did this experiment on 6-month-old babies. They brought them into a puppet stage setting similar to the last one we talked about, and they had the babies sitting on their parents' lap. The children were divided into 2 different groups. The first saw a series of white posters with 8 black dots on each. The other group saw a series of white posters with 16 dots on each. The first half saw an array with 8 medium-sized dots for as long as they wanted. When they looked away and they looked back, they would see a new array of 8 small dots. The dots would be different arrays than the previously shown ones, but always 8 dots. Over the trials, their looking time would gradually decrease. As this was happening, the second group was seeing the same thing, but just with 16 dots instead of 8. The researchers used the familiarization procedure, which was showing the children the 16 and 8 arrays of dots over 14 trials or until the babies got bored. So after that happened, the second part of the experiment began. Both groups of babies were shown alternating posters of 8 and 16 dots. To make sure the children were focusing on the numbers and nothing else, the shapes, brightness, and density were all the same. What they found was that babies who were bored with the arrays of 8 dots would be more interested when they showed them arrays of 16 dots and vice versa. With different studies, they have found that while 6-month-old babies could also differentiate between 16 and 32 dots, they were unable to differentiate numbers with smaller differences. For example, 4 and 6 are 8 and 12. Their findings found that babies younger than 6 months can differentiate between 4 and 12. For 6-month-old babies, they can differentiate between 8 and 16. And for 9-month-olds, they can differentiate between 8 and 12. They also found that babies don't just respond to the visual differences of the quantity of dots, but the babies can also discriminate 8 from 16 dots. And also, they can discriminate a puppet who jumped 8 times from a puppet who also jumped 16 times. So they found through the study that babies could differentiate the number of sounds, and through the study they have discovered that babies are wired to have a sense of approximate number sense.
Okay, so you may be thinking, well, how do we use all of this research? So, given all of this research into why connections are an essential skill for children, Galinsky put together 12 tips for parents or teachers to use. So, the very first tip is allow children to make connections in fun and playful ways. So, during undergrad, we worked on putting together interest inventories or surveys to use in our class in order to get to know what our students like. If we as educators can connect reflect the students' hobbies and passions, then the connections that they're able to make are greater and stronger. One story that Galinsky shared was one that involved a student who was fascinated with everything to do with weather. The teacher noticed this and allowed him to use the computer in order to build research on the weather every single day. And then he was labeled the classroom weatherman. So this improved his overall computer skills, his social skills because he was presenting every day, and also his graphing skills because the weather trends strengthened his math skills, and then he was able to share that with the class. Tip number 2 is to acknowledge that mistakes are okay and they are part of learning. Students can often get frustrated when they make mistakes. However, these mistakes often lead to new discoveries and help the students or the children build on connections in different ways. As an adult witnessing these mistakes, it is our job to encourage them to continue working and not allow them to give up. Students will work hard and persevere much more often if a teacher uses words such as keep trying, that was really close, or maybe try it in a different way and I'm sure you can get it. A perfect example is when a child is playing with these sorting blocks that have different shapes and the corresponding shape hole. When a child fails to fit the circle shape into a square hole, they usually don't give up. Instead, they try a different hole and they explore the different shapes to see if those then match. Tip number 3 is to promote object sense and allow experience with their functions. By showing children that an everyday object doesn't have only one purpose, but instead multiple uses, they are able to make connections in their minds. For example, blocks don't just have to be used to construct a building or a tower. They can also be used as a bridge between toys. They can be used as a car to transport dolls, or even as a phone to call their friends. Galinsky noted about a time when a child hated having clean hair. She was allowed to use shampoo in the bathtub in order to make crazy hairstyles in a bathroom mirror. It was a win-win situation. This child would then be clean, and she was making connections all at the same time. A teacher also told a story about how on a hot day, a child's father had said to them, "My father told me that you could fry an egg outside today." As the other children began to laugh at this student and make fun of them, the teacher then saw this as an opportunity to put this to the test. They got out a frying pan, an egg, and placed it on the sidewalk outside of the school. Slowly, the egg started to cook, and the kids were able to connect that any type of heat can possibly cook food, but it's just dependent on how hot it is. Tip number 4. Promote object, space, and number sense with exploration and pretend play. As children begin to play and experiment with different types of toys, they often see that these items have one purpose. Through this process, you can guide them into finding new connections and finding other purposes for such toys. It is important that you aren't leading the child and being a boss, but instead just guiding them into discovery by asking them questions and promoting exploration of new ideas. It is also important to begin using directional words in play, which is what we will talk about in tip number 5. So moving on, I said using words to describe space will help make connections. To explain the importance of using descriptive words, I'm going to have you participate in an activity. You will need a piece of paper and a pencil. You can pause the video if you need time to go find these items. So our activity has some instructions. One, you're going to follow my directions. Obviously, you can't ask questions or else that would be another rule. See if your picture matches mine. We will be getting 2 sets of instructions and you will understand how making connections helps. So in the first set of instructions, the first thing I want you to do is draw a circle. Now draw 2 squares. Now draw a line. Draw an X. Draw 8 triangles. Okay, set that piece of paper aside or flip it over, use a different area, and I'm going to give you the second set of instructions. Instruction number 1, draw a circle in the middle of your paper. Number 2, draw 2 squares about the same size of that circle, one on the left side of the circle and one on the right side of the circle. Number 3, draw a horizontal line through the middle of the 3 shapes in order to connect them all together. Number 4, draw an X through only the circle, beginning each line outside of the circle and cutting through the very center of the circle. And finally, number 5, draw a total of 8 triangles, one in each corner of the squares. Are you ready to see if your instructions match mine? This is the picture you should have gotten. So, the reason for this activity was to show that in the second set of instructions, I used a lot more descriptive words in order to make your picture match mine. Forward, backward, in front of, behind, left, right, inside, outside, up, and down are all descriptive words that you can use when playing with students or children in order to help them make the connections of what you are telling them.
Okay, so tip number 6 is play games that involve finding their way in space. So children like playing games such as treasure hunts or scavenger hunts. So when playing these types of games, they are making connections and finding their way through following directions and using their prior knowledge to navigate. Saying things like left side of the room or behind the couch helps students know where to go and where to look. Ever since I was a child, my mom made a scavenger hunt for my sister and I to find a specific present. She gave us clues that eventually led to a final destination where the present is located. Simple things like that can really get a kid engaged in making connections, and it can be fun. Tip number 7, talk about quantities in many ways. There are different parts of the brain that are involved with those. One part is for approximate numbers, one for verbal numbers, and one for written Arabic numerals. When talking about numbers to children, use a variety of ways to show and tell the student the number. For example, when you say the number 3, hold up 3 fingers and draw 3 objects. This helps the student make the connections between all ways to represent the number. You can also say, it is Wednesday, we were in school Monday and yesterday. So how many days have we been in school this week? They can connect these days of the week also represent the number 3. Finally, it is important to also answer why when talking with young children. A parent used an example about going on walks. While they walk, they count different things they see. He also always makes sure to answer his daughter's questions. By giving the answer, they're exploring and making connections with various parts of the world. On to tip 8. It is giving children family work that involves counting. So this idea can be as simple as counting each step they take from one destination to another, counting the numbers of chairs at the table, or even counting to calm themselves down. As children get older, they can move on to more complex counting, such as saving money, tracking on the calendar, or just skip counting by 2s, 5s, 10s, or even hundreds. This is a simple way to apply what they know, build their number sense, and make connections at home. Cooking is also a good example for fractions, but also counting basic items. Right, and tip number 9 is build on children's sense of approximate numbers. So one researcher believes that we can help children understand exact relationships among numbers by building on their sense of approximate numbers. So for older kids, you have 15, you get 7 more. Your friend has 15, who has more? And for younger kids, just like 15 versus 60. And so, as you can tell, older kids have a more complex understanding of approximate numbers. Younger children need the numbers to be largely different in order to be able to make those connections. If you were to give a younger child the example shown, you may see them begin counting up from 15 in order to identify the exact number before being able to compare.
Tip number 10, develop games that adapt tasks for making connections. These types of games are commonly found within the classroom without educators even realizing that kids are making connections while doing them. These types of games need to be fun and engaging in order for kids to enjoy them and use them for their intended purpose of making connections. The color game is when a student connects items that are alike based on their color. So the shape game is similar, but instead of grouping shapes that are alike, they are grouping shapes that are alike rather than what their colors are. The size game consists of a child categorizing things based on their size. This could either be how large they are in real life, or you could give them tangible things, like such as a paperclip, a hair tie, and maybe a book. The paperclip and hair tie are going to be more similar, so they would group those and make those connections rather than the book. And then there's also what we call FIST activities. It's an acronym, FIST, and that stands for Flexible Item Selection Task. In these, you would get a set of 3 cards, and then you would have the students make connections based on those cards. For example, if I gave a child a picture of a black orangutan, a black cat, and an elephant, they could categorize the orangutan and the cat together based on their color. They would also connect that the orangutan and the elephant are large animals, so they could be categorized together. This allows the student to have a variety of answers based on their ability to connect, hence the word being flexible. Tip number 11 is to promote making connections by giving feedback on their thinking. Along with the connections the children make while playing their age-appropriate games, they also need feedback on their thinking. This can overall increase the performance on any given task. The feedback should be helpful and encouraging. The feedback can also have them think of another way to connect the items. You could say, "This card shows a yellow lemon. If we were playing the color game, what could we connect that yellow lemon with?" The child may choose the yellow pencil. Then you could say, "Right, but if we were playing the shape game, what could we connect the yellow lemon with?" The student may then decide to connect it with the red button because both items are more circular or round. This allows the child to reflect and see different possibilities for making connections. And finally, tip number 12 is helping children see things in different ways. We have different pictures here on the slide to help students see things in a different way in order to make connections and see different perspectives. These 2 pictures are great examples of what Galinsky was talking about. Some people look at this rabbit-duck picture and only see one of the 2 things. So the duck's face is facing the left, but if you look at the rabbit, the ears are pointing to the left. By explaining and showing the other point of view to kids, they can connect and understand that not everyone sees and thinks the same way originally. The face-vase picture does the exact same thing. Although it is very difficult to see both at the exact same time, students can usually end up seeing both pictures once given the explanation and shown in a different way. So, in conclusion, we have a quote from Marilyn Ferguson. She said, "Making mental connections is our most crucial learning tool, the essence of human intelligence, to forge links, to go beyond the given, to see patterns, relationships, and context."